In this episode, we'll take a look at all of the audio recorders that I've used that are still in production at least. And this is just meant as a series of data points. We're not doing in-depth reviews of any one recorder here, but I do have reviews in-depth for most of these recorders, and you will find the links for those in the description below. Also, this video is very long. Skip ahead to the section for the types of recorders that you're most interested in. You can find that along the timeline here if you just scrub your finger or mouse. And if that doesn't work, they're down in the description. First up, let's talk about handheld recorders. This is where a lot of people start when they first get into video production if they want to record audio independent of their camera. Why do you even want a recorder? Why don't you just record with your camera's microphone? Camera microphones are not that great. And it's not that the microphones themselves are bad, it's that the microphone is usually pretty far away from the person that you're filming if you're doing dialogue recording. And so having a recorder oftentimes allows you to use a microphone closer to the person. That's probably the biggest benefit. And well, that's one of the benefits. But the other thing is that you can control them independently. You can have a person dedicated to sound if that works for your workflow. Those are some things to keep in mind. The first one that I started using when I first started doing video was the Zoom H1. We're now on the Zoom H1n. This is a tiny little stereo recorder that has two inbuilt microphones, and I don't typically use the inbuilt microphones for recording dialogue. In that case, what I did is I connected a lavalier microphone to myself, a little lapel mic, and then ran that into the 3.5mm input on the Zoom H1, and that works pretty well. It's almost like a wireless system without wireless transmission. You just record to the recorder, and then in post, you sync that up with the video from your camera, and you're set to go. And that can improve the quality of your sound pretty dramatically. Now, the inbuilt microphones are okay for capturing ambient sound. So if you want a stereo ambient recording, that's fine. With all of these handheld recorders, you have to be aware that none of them have shock mounts, I don't think. Yeah, all of them that I'm going to talk about don't have shock mounts. So what that means is as you touch and handle the recorder, that's going to transfer into those inbuilt microphones. So you have to be careful with that. If you have a lavalier microphone attached, it's not going to transfer that as much. You're going to have other issues to worry about there. If a lavalier microphone starts rubbing against clothing or something like that, that's when you're going to have issues with that. But in any case, it worked well for me. It was a nice way to get a lavalier microphone recorded into a little recorder that sat here by me doing these talking head videos, and the camera operated separately. In post, we synced them up, and we were good to go. Another one that's very similar to that, a little bit larger, is the Tascam DR-05. I think there's a newer iteration of this. The only real advantages this one had, from my point of view, over the original H1 and the H1n maybe, is the build quality was a little bit better. They're all plastic, but the Tascam seemed a little bit more solid. And the Tascam's inbuilt microphones, instead of being directional cardioid stereo microphones, they are omnidirectional. So if you want to be able to pick up sound from all sides when you're capturing ambient sounds, stereo recordings, then the Tascam D05 might be a better choice. If you're going to record with a lavalier microphone into your recorder, the DR-05 is not a great choice. Its 3.5mm input was quite noisy. Wouldn't recommend it. I'd go with the H1n instead. Next up, the venerable. It's not really venerable, it's just very common. That is the Zoom H4n. I had the original H4 back in 2007, I think it was. This has evolved a little bit. The H4n Pro is the current iteration of that. I have the H4n. This recorder is really common amongst those that are first getting their start. That's okay. The big problem with it is that its preamplifiers don't supply a whole lot of gain, and if you get it to the top, kind of its highest settings, the most gain settings, it tends to get pretty noisy. So it's not the best combination with a lot of other budget microphones if you're going to use an external microphone, and that's the trick. The problem is that it was a really popular recorder because it was fairly affordable, about $200, along with fairly inexpensive or the most reasonably priced shotgun microphones. I think the Rode NTG2 was the most common at the time. It's kind of a bad combination because the Rode NTG2 needed a lot of gain and the H4n couldn't provide a lot of gain, and so you would gain it to the max, get that microphone as close as you could, which that part is good. But even so, the NTG2 just couldn't put out enough signal, and so you had to boost it in post, and then it was a noisy mess. So the H4n Pro improves upon that by a couple of dB, but it's okay. It's an okay place to start, especially with some of the other microphones that are available today, like the Audio-Technica AT875R. which puts out a stronger signal, and it's a cleaner combination. So it's an okay start. Still not my favorite, but you can get by with that, and you can actually produce some pretty good sound. Next up the list is the Zoom H5n. The H5n is different from the H4n Pro in that it has a removable inbuilt stereo microphone capsule that you can replace with other things. I'm not a huge fan of those capsules. I mean, for dialogue recording at least. They can be great for ambient sound capture. Again, got to be careful with handling noise. My suggestion is get everything set up, press record, and then just have a firm grip on any of these recorders. Otherwise, you're going to pick up handling noise, and that way just be very intentional about how you move it around. You're probably going to need some wind protection if you're working outdoors with those microphones, so just all things to consider there. H5, probably preferred over the H4n Pro. It provides just a tiny bit more gain. Again, it's okay. That's about all I have to say about that one. Next up is the Zoom H6. There were a lot of these sold as well. The difference here is you have a color screen now. You have 4 XLR inputs instead of just 2. There maybe can supply another decibel or 2, so you're getting a little bit more gain on each iteration up. And it also features the interchangeable capsule system, so if you want to bring in other microphones, you can connect that to this as well. I'm not a huge fan of those, but they're okay. And you can make good recordings with this as well. One other recorder that's new since the last time we did this in 2019 is the Zoom H8. This one got a lot of skepticism when it first came out as being one of the ugliest recorders ever. To me, that's not important. The question is whether or not it's functional and it fits the purposes that you have for it. And I think it's a pretty decent recorder. It basically is a step up from the H6 in terms of the fact that it has 6 XLR inputs, plus the inbuilt stereo microphones, which are interchangeable capsule capable as well. This one adds a few different modes. It has a touch screen, and it allows you to use different modes. For example, if you're recording a podcast, it has a special mode that's made for podcasting. The preamplifiers are okay, not amazing. They're probably better than the H6, not quite as good as the Tascam Portacapture X8. As a Zoom recorder, it is pretty battery power efficient, so the batteries last longer than they would in an equivalent Tascam recorder. And overall, it's a decent recorder. Go take a look at the review if you're really interested in that one. I would say the king of this category, however, currently in 2022, is the Tascam Portacapture X8. What this adds is a few things. Number one, it has a really large screen that's touchscreen, and it adds the ability to record wide dynamic range 32-bit float. What does that mean? That means that you can record, and under most circumstances, you will not run the risk of clipping your audio. Clipping audio is when you turn the gain up too high. The sound is louder than you anticipated. And in digital audio, if it goes all the way up to 0 dB, which is the loudest it can record, on most recorders, that will sound distorted, horrible, unusable, and just really grating to the ears to listen to. It's like fingernails on a chalkboard. However, with a wide dynamic range 32-bit float capability, you can actually go above 0 dB. And what happens then is in post, in your audio editing app or video editing app, you actually pull the levels down and you can restore all that. With a typical recorder, all the recorders we've talked about so far that do not record wide dynamic range 32-bit float, if you pull those levels down in post, it's still going to sound distorted. It'll just be quieter. So you'll get quiet distortion. So that's what's really unique about the Tascam Portacapture X8. Now, is this a perfect recorder? No. First of all, it's about $400 US at the time of this recording. They dropped the price by $100. I don't know if that's permanent or temporary, but there are a few things. Number one, if you are really intent on recording at high sample rates, it does appear that something in the recorder does make a little bit of noise at very high frequencies. Most people can't hear it, but some people that are doing sound design are just not going to find that acceptable. So just so you're aware, that's going to be not very many people, but if that is you and that is the type of thing that you're doing, really careful recordings of sound effects that you're going to really, really slow down or really, really speed up, that's when you could run into potential issues there. The inbuilt microphones are okay, not amazing. And I would also caution, if you're going to record from a soundboard, say for example, if you're a wedding videographer, none of these are my favorite for that. Sometimes those DJs run the soundboards really, really hot, and these can have trouble with that. They can end up with just clipped audio, so not always the best choice for that. Just, you can make it work under most circumstances. You may have to work with the mixer that's running, or the DJ who's running the board, but these are not the best tools for that job, but you can make them work in a pinch. So in this section, I'd give the prize to the Portacapture X8. If you're on a really tight budget and you want to be able to connect a lavalier microphone, I think the Zoom H4n is your choice. Let's move up into the next category, and this category has changed substantially from the last time we did this video in 2019, and that is body pack recorders. Now, body pack recorders have a huge advantage and a pretty big disadvantage in most cases. Let me explain. First of all, the big downside for most of these, not all of them, but most of them, is that you cannot monitor or listen to the audio from these once you start rolling, once you start filming. And the reason for that is that the body pack recorder is a recorder that the person who it's attached to wears, and they'll have usually a lavalier microphone that goes along with that. And this is really great, for example, a lot of times for wedding videographers, this is what they do. They put one of these on the groom, they maybe put another one on the officiant. They might even put one on the bride too. It's a little harder to hide on the bride, but you can do it. And they start the recording, and then that just rolls for the entire wedding ceremony. And the problem is you don't know if that lavalier microphone is rubbing against clothing and making a noise, or if it's somehow, the plug gets pulled out of the lavalier microphone from the body pack recorder or something like that. So some of these have features that help prevent the pull out of the cable. Some of them have lock switches so that the groom or whoever's wearing it can't accidentally turn off the recording. Those are all good things. But you can't also be monitoring to know when the batteries run out. So just understand that that's a risk, but it's actually workable in a lot of circumstances as well. So let's run through these. First of all is the Zoom F1. This one's a little bit older now, not my favorite. It's pretty bulky. It is versatile because you can connect those interchangeable Zoom mics again. Feels like the Zoom show in a lot of ways from what we've covered so far. And I don't really find those super helpful in the one shotgun microphone capsule that they sent when I did the review of that one a few years ago. It was picking up interference from my phone, so you were getting this weird digital sound. Not my favorite, but it's an option. Second one, and this was definitely one I preferred last time we did this video, and that's a Tascam DR-10, and there are a few different models depending on which part of the world you're in. Here in the United States, it's the 10L. This is a really good recorder. The included lav is okay, and you can replace it with a better lavalier microphone if you chose to. And we have lots of microphone reviews on our channel of different lavalier microphones, for example. So if you just do a search for Curtis Judd lavalier, you'll find lots of different reviews there. I do like the safety track feature. So what that is when you're recording, if somebody gets really loud, it doesn't have the 32-bit float wide dynamic range recording, but what it does do is it records the same thing to two different tracks at the gain level you set, the input level you set, plus at a lower input level. So if the main track clips in post, you can cut over to this lower input level track, and that one may not be clipped. And so that'll potentially save you in some circumstances, and especially in cases when you're recording something that's not scripted and someone just unexpectedly gets loud and you can't run up and say, hey, wait a minute, don't do that. Let me change the input level on this body pack recorder first and then get rid of that. Obviously not feasible in most cases. So that safety track feature is really helpful. Next one, and this is where we're moving into the newer items in this category, is first of all the Tentacle Track E. Now this is a company, Tentacle Sync, that traditionally has made timecode generators. Completely different topic here. But now they also make a recorder, and this is a little body pack recorder, small plastic recorder. It has the 32-bit float wide dynamic range recording capability, and it's also a timecode generator. So timecode is just a tool that allows you to sync audio and video back together in post more quickly. Now this is mostly useful in cases when you're working on narrative films and you're going to come back at the end of a day with tens to hundreds of clips. Syncing each of those manually can take a lot of time. But with a timecode generator, and you'd have to have one for each of your cameras as well, that makes this a little bit easier. So the Tentacle Track E, Really good option. It does have an inbuilt battery, so when that battery is spent some number of years down the road, you probably have to send it in to get it replaced, so that's a little bit of a downside. You control it from an app on your phone, either iOS or Android. And this is the only one of these that it's the only one of the non-wireless ones, and we'll talk about those in just a minute, that does allow you to monitor the audio. So you can actually plug in headphones to your phone that's connected to the Track E, and it allows you to monitor. Now, that comes with a caveat. It's doing it via Bluetooth, and the audio is delayed before it gets to you to some extent. So if you're standing close to the person who's wearing the body pack and the microphone, you'll hear them through your headphones, and then it'll kind of echo into you'll hear them in real life, and then it will, a few milliseconds later, play in your headphones. So there'll be a little bit of a disorienting latency there, but it'll at least allow you to hear and make sure that, it's still running, and that, you're not getting a bunch of clothing rustle on the microphone or anything like that. So that's a really pretty good option. The included lavalier microphone is okay. It's okay. It's probably going to need some EQ in post to make it sound better. I actually found the microphone on the next recorder, which we'll now move to, sounded better, and that is the Zoom F2. This is also a body pack recorder, very small, and it also has a 32-bit float wide dynamic range recording capability. It is very battery efficient, so its battery will last a good long time. It's more aggressively priced. That is a lower price, which is nice. It comes in a couple different versions. There's a version with Bluetooth, and one without Bluetooth. The one without Bluetooth is less expensive. The Bluetooth feature allows you to do two things. Number one, change some of the settings and start and stop recordings from your phone. And also, if you are using a timecode workflow and you are using specifically the Atomos timecode systems UltraSync Blue, I think it is, that allows you to wirelessly jam time sync to this recorder, time code to this recorder. So that's a pretty nice feature there. That one has a lot less limited use from my point of view, because there are only a few devices that are supported by that system. Deeper conversation there. But not my favorite choice in terms of time code, but it is a really good recorder. And the included microphone is a little bit better than what came with the Tentacle Track E, just if that matters to you. But Zoom F2, I'd say pretty good option. Now, the next two options are in this category, but not exactly the same. That is because they're actually wireless microphone systems that also have the ability to record. So this is specifically the Rode Wireless Go 2, which is a system that has a single receiver for two transmitters. So two transmitters can transmit to a single receiver, and each of those transmitters has an inbuilt recorder. And it works okay. So, the nice thing is really you would use this more as a wireless microphone system, and then use the recording on the transmitter as a backup if you needed to, is really kind of how I think about this. So you can just run it as a body pack recorder if you want to do that. You don't have to use the wireless feature at all, but it's okay. You do have to download using a special app from Rode on your computer, and then you sync it up to your video and post. And this system, one of the things that kind of frustrated me a little bit about this system is that you don't have an input level setting. So with spoken word, it was possible to clip the audio at times, or you'd have to boost it up a fair bit in post depending on how loud the person's voice was. So anyway, it's okay. It's another option out there if you want to primarily do wireless, but also have a backup recording. Pretty decent option. And the next one is the DJI Mic. This is a wireless microphone system, just like the Rode Wireless Go 2. It has two transmitters to a single receiver. It can also record on the transmitters. This system is newer than the Wireless Go 2 and has some additional features, and we'll have a review of this one coming here in just the next few weeks. So if I had to choose from this whole category here, I would probably choose the Zoom F2 as of today. If I wanted to primarily do wireless, my sense is I'd probably choose the DJI Mic. Okay, let's move into consumer field recorders. Now, I'm only going to cover one recorder here. This is interestingly, this is kind of a category we haven't seen a lot of new recorders in this category for quite a while, But let me just talk about that. This from my point of view, this category is better for those that have aspirations to really get a little bit more into sound. And this is a place to start, but then you eventually want to get more into sound and maybe upgrade to a more capable recorder at some point in the future. So again, if you're on a tight budget, good place to start. Long term, probably want to save up and get something that's more expensive and also more capable. So I'll just actually call this a class of recorders I was going to talk about here. The two that I've used are the Tascam DR-60D Mk II and the Tascam DR-70D. Now I have a review of the Tascam DR-60D Mk II, which I did back in 2014. This is not a new recorder. So this recorder I like because it does one thing that some of the handheld recorders don't do, and that is it allows you to record each input independently. So that's really useful. So in post, what that means is that you can split the tracks apart and process each of them independently. Most of the handhelds do that too. There's some nuances there, but this one works pretty well. And you have, I think, nicer physical controls for the two inputs, so you can actually turn a dial as opposed to click, 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 click on some of those handheld recorders. That also results in less noise in the recording when you're trying to adjust settings. And in this case, with the Tascam DR-60D Mk II and the 70D, you don't have an inbuilt microphone, so you're actually attaching external microphones and running an XLR cable into the recorder. And this allows you to use XLR-based microphones, professional quality microphones, so that gives you that step up as well. Now, this would actually probably generally be my choice before any of the handheld recorders, maybe excepting the Tascam Portacapture X8. But this does have some downsides as well. Actually, one of the upsides before I move on to that is that it has two different outputs. One for consumer grade cameras that have microphone inputs, and a second one that has a higher output line level signal. So if you are going into a camera that has the ability to accept a line level input, some of the newer hybrid cameras are starting to offer that option. This has that ability. Now, why does that matter? It matters because then the camera isn't taking a signal that's already been amplified, and then the recorder has to drop it down to a lower level, and then the microphone input on the camera has to boost it back up. And the problem with the mic inputs on most cameras is they're not that great. They're pretty noisy. So if you do have a camera that accepts a line level input, this avoids that issue altogether, which is nice. Now, the not so great things. This runs on 4 AA batteries, but it doesn't get that great a battery life. It's probably, I think, as I recall, 3.5 hours, something like that. If you're going to be doing longer recording sessions, what I did is I rigged a USB battery bank to the back of it using some adhesive Velcro, hook and eye tape. And then I just used the USB battery to power the recorder. And that way I could record it for days at a time. So that's one thing to consider as well. So the preamps on the Tascam DR-60D Mk II and the 70D are roughly in the same class, I'd say, in terms of how much self-noise they generate as the Zoom H6, maybe a tiny bit cleaner. So again, it's a pretty good way to start if you do have longer term aspirations to get more into sound recording. The next category is what I'm going to refer to as prosumer field recorders. And these are really kind of the recorders that one graduates to after things like the Tascam DR-60D Mk II or any of the handheld recorders that we talked about before. They are substantially more expensive. They are made for field recording specifically. They're made for video and film production. They're far more robust in terms of build quality and in terms of the quality that they produce. So they have much cleaner preamplifiers. You're not going to have to be worrying about, is this preamplifier introducing noise into my recording? It's not going to be the preamp that does that. In those cases, you're going to be able to focus instead on managing the ambient noise and choosing a microphone that's going to work best for that situation and introduce as little self-noise as possible. So some of the other features that these field recorders include allow you to work really well on a film or video production set or in a studio. And that includes features like a line level output, balanced outputs, time code generators, the ability to record each individual input to its own track, and also get a stereo mix of all the tracks. They also have 32-bit float recording capability, at least those that I'm going to cover here. They also have things like auto mix, and in the case of the SoundDevices recorders, they also have a plugin that allows you to do real-time noise reduction, among other things. Now, first, there are two main players in this category that we're going to talk about here, Zoom and SoundDevices. Now, I think one thing that's really important to understand here is that these two companies are very different, and I think understanding their history and where they're coming from is important to putting everything in context here. First of all, Zoom is a consumer electronics company. They serve mass markets. They serve markets that are very price sensitive, and they produce a massive number of products. So we talked about all of the Zoom handy recorders in a previous section. That gives you a sense for where they're coming from. In the case of Zoom, the F series, which are these field recorders, these prosumer field recorders, this is kind of the top of the line that they offer for filmmakers and video production. And because this is a company that comes from a mass market consumer electronics point of view, they offer a warranty, and the products are high quality. They do perform very well over long periods of time. But once you're out of the warranty, they don't have any sort of service organization. There's not really a way to have them serviced or fixed or repaired, as far as I can tell. So that's one thing to keep in mind when you are starting to get into this category of recorders, especially if you're starting to earn money with your recordings, then having something that you can have repaired becomes a little bit more important, because it's your livelihood. It's something you're using to actually generate income. So that's the background on Zoom. On the other hand, SoundDevices comes from a very different perspective. It's a very niche company. They started making high-end recorders basically for Hollywood, and they've also been used a lot in news gathering, and a little bit in broadcast as well. So that's where SoundDevices started from, and now they've introduced a series of recorders which they call their MixPre recorders, which are made for more prosumers, more, from their point of view, more entry-level recordists. And so these recorders are not nearly as affordable. They're a little bit more, actually quite a bit more expensive than the equivalent Zoom recorders if you're just comparing them in terms of the number of inputs that they have, the number of microphone inputs. But the thing that's interesting about SoundDevices is that they do have a service organization. They do have the ability to repair your gear if it gets damaged or broken in some fashion. So that can be an important consideration if you are starting to earn money with your recorder. Again, because it's not a consumer electronics company, these recorders are kind of out of reach in terms of their price in a lot of countries. Not a lot of countries, but in some countries at least. So if you're in one of those places, it may be tougher to get into a SoundDevices recorder just because of the cost. Now, before we start talking about the details and the differences between them, I want to emphasize one thing. This is where things start getting a lot more subjective, and there are advantages and disadvantages for Zoom and advantages and disadvantages for the SoundDevices. And we've already covered some of them. For example, the SoundDevices, a lot more expensive, like almost twice as expensive for the same number of inputs on the recorder. But again, they each have their own advantages and disadvantages, and let's run into some of those. So let's first cover the Zoom F series of recorders. F stands for field recorders, and the current models include the Zoom F3, the Zoom F6, and the Zoom F8n Pro. Now, they differ kind of in their purposes for each of these. They are all wide dynamic range, 32-bit float capable. They can record very wide dynamic range. However, there's a caveat to that. Be careful if you're going to be recording from a soundboard, like, again, a lot of wedding videographers do. The inputs on these are spec'd, I believe, at least on the F3, at a max input level plus 4 dBu. What that means is if whoever's operating the mixing board, the soundboard, is running really hot levels out of that board, you're going to have potentially trouble recording to this recorder. So just be aware of that. The F3 and the F6 are interesting because they're both very, very small for the number of inputs that they have. The F3 has 2 XLR inputs. The F6 has 6 XLR inputs, and extraordinarily small. These are all made out of mostly metal, some plastic as well, but they're fairly robust, and I think they're going to last for a good amount of time. I own all 3 of these. I've actually owned an F8 since 2015 when they first came out, I believe. And they are incredibly robust units. They hold up very, very well, especially if you take good care of them. Now, the F3 and the F6 are a little bit, from my point of view, ergonomically a little bit more difficult to operate simply because they are so small. They have small buttons. The buttons are shared. In other words, they have like a little menu where they show you on screen what the button is currently assigned to do. And so there's that. On the F6, there are 4 buttons that surround the screen plus all of the knobs for each of the input channels. Just a little cramped. And so if operating something really fast and actually actively mixing is really important to you, probably want to move up to the Zoom F8n Pro or look at one of the SoundDevices mixers instead. Or there is in the Zoom product line something called the F Control, which is basically a little mixing board control surface that you can attach to the F6 and the F8n Pro. Now, on all of the Zoom F-series recorders, and I think they're all using the same preamps, they all sound the same to me. They all have 75 dB of gain, so they can power or they can amplify for any microphone out there, including the Shure SM7B. So if you're wondering about that, yes, they can amplify enough for the Shure SM7B, which is a very popular podcasting microphone. And you don't need a cloud lifter or anything like that. So that's really, really nice. They all feature an inbuilt timecode generator on the F6 and the F8n Pro, or a Bluetooth connectivity that allows you to use an external timecode generator, again from Timecode Systems Atomos. And so that's an important feature once you start working on film and video, potentially, especially on narrative film. From an ergonomics point of view, I really, really much prefer the Zoom F8n Pro just because the knobs and the dials and the layout and the way you operate everything is so much easier and so much quicker, for me at least. I know we're getting into subjective territory here, but I think it's a lot easier to operate and I can move around much more quickly on the F8n Pro than I can on the F3 or the F6. Both the F6 and the F8n Pro include an auto mix feature. This is really, really helpful for podcast recordings and also potentially for panel discussions or any sort of setup like that. And all it does essentially is it takes each of the microphone inputs where the person is not currently talking and pulls its level down and just leaves the level up for the person who is currently talking. And then when it switches to the other person talking, it quickly brings that back up. And what that results in is a much cleaner mix. The overall sound recording sounds much cleaner that way, unless you leave, versus leaving all the microphones at their full gain all the time. You're just going to be picking up a lot of room noise and out of phase audio from the person who's talking over here on this microphone into this microphone over here. And that auto mix is a real time saver in post-production if that's the type of production you're doing. Another thing that's important too is that if you're not recording in 32-bit float, and there are a lot of valid reasons to not do that, this series of recorders also includes what they call their advanced hybrid limiters. And what a limiter does essentially is that when the levels are getting close to clipping, it'll actually pull them down a little bit. In the case of the Zoom F-series, those are implemented in a digital way. That's one of the things about Zoom as a consumer electronics company. They try to implement, their ethos is they try to implement as many things in the digital realm as possible because they can offer firmware updates to fix problems or to maybe even add additional features. And so whenever they can, they implement features digitally. Now, that's good because you can get firmware updates and get additional features. It's not so good because there are certain cases in audio when an analog processor actually can do a better job versus a digital processor. And a limiter is one example of that. So while the limiters work well, they do a good job if you're not recording in 32-bit float, but they do raise the noise floor a little bit. But what I mean by noise floor is that if somebody's talking and then they stop talking, the noise floor is what you hear. It's like the room tone you hear in between, but that's always present, even when they're talking. And the problem is that when you're using that limiter, it can potentially raise the noise floor just a little bit. So just one thing to keep in mind, it's not horrible. Again, the preamps are very, very clean on the Zoom F-series, so it's not a massive problem, but it is one, I think, advantage that the MixPre has. Same thing with the low-cut filters. They're implemented digitally, so all of that low-frequency rumble is going to go ahead and come in your preamplifier. Maybe stress the preamp a little bit because it's got all this low frequency rumble energy in it. Put that through the digital converter, and then after it gets through the converter, then it cuts out all that low frequency energy. Probably not the most optimal way to do that. Can you tell a difference? Possibly. That's where I think an analog low-cut filter in the analog preamplifier stage may actually be a better implementation. And you certainly see that in the professional level mixers and recorders. Let's now move to the MixPre 2 series. The MixPre 2 series includes 3 recorders, the MixPre 3.2, the MixPre 6.2, and the MixPre 10.2. All of these have 3, 4, or 8 XLR inputs plus a 3.5mm stereo input, which is where you get the numbers, sort of. 3 is just one exception. In any case, they are great recorders. They all support wide dynamic range 32-bit float recording, but they also have some other features that you don't see on the Zoom F-Series. For example, they have analog input limiters for each independent channel, and so those are the things that prevent your audio from clipping when you're not recording in 32-bit float, and they are a little bit more transparent not transparent so much, but they don't add room tone like you will find a little bit on the Zoom F-Series. And they also have analog low-cut filters. This is going to kind of represent the ethos of SoundDevices, which is coming from the professional level recorder world. So they use analog when it makes more sense, like on input limiters. And they also do lots of things digitally as well, which we'll cover in just a minute. First thing you'll notice about the MixPre series is the screen is much smaller. It's actually a touch screen. That's not the case on the Zoom F-Series. It's a small touchscreen, and at first I thought, oh, that seems like a really bad combination, but they've actually implemented it quite nicely. There's never more than about 6 buttons on the screen at a time, so just a finger, easily you can tap with a finger, not a problem. They've actually implemented it quite nicely. I actually prefer the ergonomics overall of the MixPre series over the Zoom F-Series, especially the Zoom F3 and the F6. The F8's a little bit closer, but I do find the menus a little bit easier to navigate and more quickly get things configured than on the Zoom F-Series. That's a subjective thing to some extent. One thing to consider is that some people don't like the touchscreen because if you're working outside where it's really hot, your fingers are all sweaty or maybe they got wet somehow, the touchscreen's not great when you have a wet finger. So that is one thing to consider. For me, that's not generally a problem. I'm not usually working in those circumstances where it's problematic. So not a big issue for me, but thought I should mention it. Whereas the Zoom F-Series, at least the F6 and the F8n Pro, include things like ambisonics recording, 3D audio if you want to call it that, but ambisonics is the technical name, and an auto mix feature. These are all plugins on the SoundDevices MixPre series, and those plugins cost money. So the downside of the MixPre series is they're substantially more expensive from the start, but then also if you want these additional features, you have to pay more money for them. So on the bright side, you can think of it as, well, I didn't have to pay that money because I don't need that plugin. I guess that's the silver lining way to look at it. But if you're price sensitive and you have a limited budget, like many of us do, that makes the MixPre not as accessible. And it's also not quite as accessible in certain countries. It seems, again, smaller company, not as broad a reach as this massive consumer electronics company Zoom. So it's just something to consider there. Now, these plugins, on the other hand, from my point of view, are really great. First of all is the Mix Assist plugin. Again, it does a very similar thing to what AutoMix does on the Zoom F-Series, but from my point of view, I think it's more effective. It actually does a better job of making an even cleaner recording because it's more aggressive at pulling down those microphones for the people that aren't currently talking. And the end result is a cleaner recording overall. So that's one thing. Another thing is that the MixPre series has a noise assist plugin. That is a feature that is not available on the Zoom F-Series. And this is actual real-time noise reduction. It works really well if you are close miking. So for a podcast, for example, or a live stream, it works beautifully. If you have a microphone booming out and you're good distance from it, it's not going to be as useful then. But in those other circumstances, it can be an enormous help for, especially if you're going to be turning things around quickly or doing a live stream where you're not doing post-production, then that's a really useful option to have. If you're going to do ambisonics recording, that's a plugin, and it works well. I've tested it, all good, but it does cost extra money. There are also a couple of others. There's a musician's plugin, which essentially turns your MixPre into a portable digital audio workstation where you can do overdub multi-track music recording. So usually, for example, when people are recording non-orchestral types of pieces, more popular music, and they want to do multiple instruments, they'll actually record one instrument at a time and then go back to the start of the song and record another one. Or maybe they made a mistake at one point in the song and they can overdub that one little part. That's what this allows you to do. And then finally, there is also the reporter plugin, which is for situations where you're going to be sending a reporter or correspondent of some sort out into the field. They may not be the most, experienced with audio recording. And so it allows you to do some of the set up some of the settings and then put it in the reporter mode, which kind of dumbs it down and locks them out from some of the settings you don't want them messing with, just so they can't make those mistakes when they're out in the field. Simplifies the recorder and makes it really easy for someone who's not really experienced with mixing to make a good recording. There are some downsides to the MixPre, some more downsides, I guess, if you want to think of it in those terms. There's only a single card slot on all of them. However, there is a USB-A port in addition to a USB-C port. And in that USB-A port, you can put a thumb drive. And that thumb drive can record a backup recording. So as soon as you've finished recording, you press stop, it takes that recording and makes a copy of it to the USB thumb drive. So that's a pretty nice feature. You don't have that redundancy or that backup capability on the Zoom F6 or the Zoom F3. The biggest downside for a lot of people is that the MixPre series, while they're incredibly capable and they have these amazing plugins and they have amazing preamplifiers with 76 dB of gain that sound amazing, they have these amazing analog limiters, they can also record in 32-bit float and at the same time allow you to set your gain, which you can't do on the Zoom F series, by the way. When you go into 32-bit float mode, you're not setting the gain, you're setting a fader instead, which is a kind of a deeper discussion. But the downside with the MixPre is that they are not as energy efficient, which means you run through batteries more quickly. And the included AA battery sled that comes with each of them is just not enough to power it for very long. And they don't even recommend using alkaline batteries because you can only power it for probably 30 minutes with alkaline batteries. So it's almost like not useful that way. So you have to use rechargeable lithium or rechargeable nickel metal hydride at the very least. And if you need to record for longer periods of time, you need to have another power solution. On the MixPre 3 and 6, you can attach a USB battery bank via the USB-C input and power that way. Or if you're connected to a computer and using it as an audio interface, you can of course do it that way. And for the MixPre 10, there is a Hirose input, so you can use a battery distribution system or any of the bigger batteries that are available out there for field recorders. So just something you have to keep in mind. If you were planning on not using any other sort of battery source, you got to have a plan for that with a MixPre. So, which is best? There isn't a best. You have to choose which features are important for the type of work that you're doing and choose the recorder based on that. For a lot of people, a Zoom F8n Pro is going to be the right choice. If for people that need only a couple of inputs and they want great sound quality and they need to be really portable, a Zoom F3 probably makes the most sense. If you need more inputs, but you still need it to be really small, well, maybe the Zoom F6 is the best choice for you. If you need all those really great plugins that can do amazing things, then the MixPre series might be a better choice for you. So there's one last thing. This has never affected me, but some people absolutely insist that this was the case for them, as they were aspiring production sound mixers or location sound mixers. The fact that they had a SoundDevices product, they claim got them jobs that they would not have gotten if they were using a Zoom recorder. I've never experienced that personally, but some people say that's actually a thing, so that's another factor to consider. If I had to choose personally, this is just for me, just for the type of work that I do, I would probably prefer a MixPre recorder, but I own all of these. The only one I don't currently own is a MixPre 6.2, but I do own a MixPre 3.2, 10.2, Zoom F3, Zoom F6, Zoom F8n Pro. They are all amazing recorders, and you can make amazing recordings with all of them. Beautiful sound quality, really great feature set. You just have to choose amongst all those. So I have in-depth reviews of all of these in the links down below. Let's move on to the next category, and that is podcast recorders. We didn't cover this last time. Most of them have come out actually since then, and that is the podcast recorders. These are all-in-one recorders that are also USB audio interfaces, so you can connect them to your computer. In some cases, you can connect them to your mobile devices and record to those. They also have sound pad players usually, so you can play back pre-recorded sounds for your show. And in most cases, they have ways for you to connect remote guests, whether that's via your computer or your phone. So these are really optimized for podcast recording and possibly for live streaming. So let's run through all of them. First of all, let me cover the Zoom recorders. There are actually three of them I want to cover. First is the Zoom Podtrak P4. This is the least expensive in this category that I've used. And this one comes in at $200 US. It has 4 microphone preamplifiers, XLR inputs, and it can supply up to 70 dB of gain. So it can drive the most popular podcast microphone at the current time, which is the Shure SM7B. It is one of the microphones that requires more gain than any other microphone. So you have to have a really strong preamplifier to drive it. and the Podtrak P4 can deliver on that front without a problem. There are also 4 independent headphone outputs with independent volume controls for each of them, so that makes it really nice if you have in-person guests. It can be powered on 2 AA batteries or via USB, so you have lots of options there for powering this unit. It's quite energy efficient, so even with 2 AA batteries, you should be able to get through any show. And Podtrak P4 also has an add-on Bluetooth dongle, which allows you to add a remote guest via maybe a mobile phone over Bluetooth. So that's a pretty nice feature. And it does do mix minus. So if you've heard of that and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't really understand mix minus, but I know I need mix minus. Yes, it supports all of these support mix minus, so it's not a problem. You can also connect via wire if you prefer to do that. So if you've got a headphone jack, or you can add the Lightning to 3.5 millimeter adapter if you're on an iPhone and bring the guests in that way as well. I guess that's about where the really positive sides of this recorder come in. But again, $200, you have to remember. So there are some things that I don't love about it. Number one is that its build quality is like plastic, and not the greatest grade of plastic. Mine got really scratched up pretty quickly. Doesn't feel like it's super durable. So if you're on the move all the time, the great thing is this is really small. On the other hand, if you're on the move all the time, you don't want to just huck this into a backpack. You're going to need to protect it in some fashion so it doesn't get too beat up in the transport. There's one annoying feature, and I don't know why Zoom did this, and it's not important, it just annoys the heck out of me, and that is the max recording bit depth is 16-bit and the max sampling rate is 44.1 kilohertz. Is that going to be a problem for most of us that are recording podcasts? For most people, probably not. You can still even do this with video, but it just annoys me because the video standard for many, many years has been 48 kilohertz. I don't know why don't they just support 48 kilohertz as well. It's 2022. Every recorder almost on the market supports 48 kilohertz, except for this one and the next one we're going to cover also from Zoom. So just a weird decision. Is that going to affect most people that are recording podcasts? Probably not. If you don't even know what I'm talking about, forget about it. Just a weird choice on Zoom's part. Don't know why they did that. Next up is the Podtrak P8, which is the bigger sibling to the Podtrak P4. The main difference here is that it's more of a form factor like a mixing board. So it's much bigger. It's not as portable, but you can still, it's small enough and light enough that if you prefer this form factor, you could still make it work for portable purposes. It does have 6 XLR inputs. It does supply 70 dB of gain for each of those inputs. It's priced at about $425 at the time of this recording. And it is a little bit more durable feeling than the Podtrak P4. It's still not to the level of some of the higher end recorders that we're going to talk about in just a minute, but pretty good. The processing effects on this and actually the Podtrak P4 are not that great. They're okay. They're simple, they're easy to set up, but they're all digital and they're just not that great. If the effects are really important to you, things like compressors or EQ or anything like that, these are not the recorders you should buy, the Podtrak P4 or the P8. Again, strangely, Zoom made the decision to only make this 16-bit and 44.1 kilohertz. Again, if you don't even know what that means, probably going to be fine for you, but just a kind of a frustrating thing. Overall, this works really nicely. You can bring in remote guests again via computer or mobile device if you need to do that. And it does have the sound pads to play back sounds, just like the Podtrak P4. It's a pretty good, for $425, it's pretty good. There's one more Zoom recorder I want to talk about. That is the LiveTrak L-8. It's a little bit older than the Podtrak series. It actually was Zoom's first recorder series that they set up for recording live bands, like music bands. But they also made the L8, which also had some podcast features on it, namely the little pads to play back pre-recorded sounds. So this one actually also has 6 XLR inputs. However, it only supplies 54 dB of gain. So you cannot drive microphones like the Shure SM7B without some help, like a preamp helper, like a cloud lifter or a FET head. If you're not familiar with those are roughly $100 to $200 devices that provide additional gain for gain-hungry microphones like a Shure SM7B or most dynamic microphones. So this one doesn't make as much sense. It does, on the other hand, strangely support 24-bit, 48 kilohertz audio recording. Not my top recommendation in 2022, but if you are interested, we do have an in-depth review on this one as well. let's talk about my favorite amongst this group. It's not perfect, but my favorite is the RODECaster Pro II. This came out just earlier this year in 2022. This one has 4 microphone inputs, 4 XLR inputs that supply up to 76 dB of gain. It can easily drive the Shure SM7B. It includes Bluetooth connectivity, so if you want to bring in a remote guest via a mobile device, you can do that. Or it also includes 2 USB connections, so you can actually connect to 2 separate computers or a mobile device and a computer. And that's actually really useful. So you can play back sounds or bring in a remote guest on your computer, and it does an automatic mix minus again, like all of these do, so that your guest is not hearing themselves like come over the telephone line and then come back to them. Or a Zoom call or whatever. So that's one thing. But you can also, if you're a live stream gaming channel, if you have something like that and you want to hook up your gaming audio, your gaming rig, and your streaming rig, you can do that with the RODECaster Pro II. That's the only of these podcast recorders that can do something like that. So it's a pretty impressive features. It does have 8 dedicated physical sound pads, but you can also switch between banks and apply other sounds, and it also plays back effects. But the most important thing that I like about the RODECaster Pro II is its processing effects are the best of all of these. It has the best compressor, the best EQ, it has a de-esser, it has a noise gate, it has what they call big bottom, which gives you kind of a broadcast sound. It has an aural exciter, which gives a little shimmer to the higher end of your voice. So they're really great processing effects. And not to worry, if you're not familiar with how to set those up, you can actually go into a basic mode that just gives you 3 controls, and you just kind of tweak them and listen and find what sounds best for your particular voice or the voices of your guests. And that's great. You can also go to an advanced mode and tweak all of the little settings and parameters for each of those. So it gives you kind of the best of both worlds. So that's why the RODECaster Pro II is my favorite. However, it is not without its flaws. And the biggest flaw that hasn't been a problem for me, but for some people who are very sensitive to this, it is a problem, and that is the input to output analog latency. What I mean by that is I talk into the microphone and I have the headphones on. I get 4 headphone outputs with independent volume controls for each of the headphones. If I talk into my microphone, it is 6 milliseconds before I hear myself back in the headphones. Typically for me, most people can't tell until there's about a 10 milliseconds latency. This is 6, but some people are really sensitive and they can hear that, and it's really annoying to them. If you're one of those people, this is probably not the best choice for you. For me, not a huge problem. It's a little annoying at times when I'm trying to set up things for my own voice, but for my other guests and things like that, I didn't find it to be a problem at all. So you have to decide for yourself if that's a problem, but aside from that one issue, I found the RODECaster Pro II to be the most capable of all of the podcast recorders. We're moving into the final category, and I'm going to cover this one fairly quickly because people that are really shopping in this category probably are not watching this video. They might aspire to work with these types of recorders, but as the pro level recorders, these are the types of recorders that are used in the film and television industries. And these are much more expensive, and therefore much bigger productions where they have the budget to easily afford these types of things. They're used by production sound mixers who are the ones responsible for capturing sound. That's usually in cases where you have multiple people on the sound team for a production. So that's going to be the production sound mixer, who's the one who's operating these recorders and mixers. And then there's also going to be a boom operator and a utility sound technician. So what makes these different? Yes, they have amazing preamplifiers and they sound great and they make amazing recordings, but that's not the only thing they do. They do much more than that. They have additional features that most people that are doing even kind of entry-level corporate video or any sort of passion project, YouTube videos, probably don't need these other features. And they include things like a massive number of inputs, large number of outputs. And why do you need large number of outputs? Obviously, large number of inputs is kind of an obvious one. If you have lots of actors that have microphones on them, you're going to need a large number of inputs. But the outputs is for things like sending different mixes to different members of the crew, sending a mix to the director, one to the script supervisor, maybe another one to the producers, and maybe another one to other members of the crew. Also, you have to have a feed, a wireless feed in most cases for your boom operator. Another one for your utility sound technician. So if the utility sound technician is responsible for managing all the wireless mics on all of the actors, they're going to need a mix that gives them the ability to hear those lavalier microphones and really be able to kind of tune those in. Your boom operator may not want to hear as much of the lavalier microphones. Maybe they want the boom mic to be more prominent, or maybe they want the boom mic in one ear and the lavs in the other ear. And that gives them the ability to make sure that they're, cueing the microphone, the boom microphone correctly and getting the best possible sound. So there are lots and lots of needs that we don't typically need when we're working on YouTube videos or kind of entry-level corporate video or things like that. They usually have comms integration so that the production sound mixer can communicate with the rest of the sound team, with the utility and with the boom operator or operators. And likewise, that those people can communicate back with the production sound mixer who's sitting over in Video Village. These recorders typically also have slot-in wireless systems. You can either add them on or they're built into the mixer recorder themselves. This allows you to add wireless receivers and bring in lots of wireless channels of audio. So in this case, for example, I have a SoundDevices 888 with the SL2, which is a 2-slot system. On this 2-slot system, I can bring in up to 8 channels of audio via 2 receivers. Each receiver would have to, in that case, receive 4 different channels of audio. In my case, these will actually only receive 2. So I have a total here of 4 channels of wireless audio, but most of the pro level recorders have this capability. And what's nice about these is that not only does it make it so you don't have to run as many wires in your bag to get the audio out of the wireless receivers into your recorder mixer, they also allow you to control the receivers generally from the mixer itself. So it makes it a lot easier to manage everything because you've got a lot going on when you're a production sound mixer. These mixers also typically support AES digital input, so they can bring in digital audio. So for example, with my SL2 system here, all of that audio is actually converted at the transmitter. The wireless transmitter is converted from analog to digital audio, and the rest of the pipeline is all digital straight into the mixer. So it never has to convert it back to analog and then convert it back again to digital like you would with a consumer recorder, or even a prosumer recorder for that matter. And then on some of them, they also support Dante, which is digital audio over Ethernet. And you can usually bring in massive numbers of channels that way as well. So you would have, for example, a input box over on closer to set where you might have your wireless receivers, and then you run all of that via a single Ethernet cable or maybe a double Ethernet cable if you need redundancy on some of the higher end systems. And you can run all of that directly via Ethernet into your recorder. So amazing capabilities that we don't have with the prosumer and consumer level recorders. Now, let me tell you specifically about the SoundDevices 8 series recorders. I previously used the 6 series recorders, which are their previous generation. The 8 series includes the 833, the 888, and the Scorpio. I've used all 3 of them. I use the 833 at work on a daily basis, and the 888 we're actually recording this right now with the 888, and I use that for my freelance location sound work. So these recorders are incredibly capable. We've covered most of the features. The 888, for example, is a 20-track recorder with 16 inputs. So you might ask, well, why do you need 20 tracks for recording if you only have 16 inputs? It can also record buses and stereo mixes and things like that. So the Scorpio can actually record up to 36 tracks and is a 32 input recorder. And then the 833, of course, is less than that. But these are all very similar aside from the number of inputs and a few features. So for example, on the Scorpio, you have 2 Ethernet jacks on it. So you can have a primary Dante input and a secondary or redundant Dante input. On the 888, you have a single Ethernet input. So you just have Dante connectivity. And then on our 833, you do not have Dante connectivity. So just to kind of show you how they're differentiated. These recorders all record to 2 separate SD cards plus an internal SSD drive. So they like a triple redundant type of setup. And you can record different things to each of those media sources if you want, or you can record the same thing and use them as backups. So you have lots of options there as well. And not only can you route different things to those different media, you can also, you have very, very, very kind of flexible routing or routing, if you prefer to say it that way, of the input. So if you connect a microphone to input number 1, you can actually route that anywhere. You can send it to a different bus, you can send it to the left and right mix, or you don't have to, and you can do all sorts of different things. And in fact, what you call track 1 in the recording is not necessarily input 1. So you could actually route input 1 over to track number 2 or 4, or whatever. I mean, you just have complete flexibility. Again, something that you don't see on the consumer or even on the prosumer recorders. And those are the kind of things that production sound mixers need, that flexibility. They need to be able to make those decisions. Powering these is actually quite a joy as well, from the standpoint that you have lots of options. So for example, the 833, the 888, and the Scorpio all have the Sony NPF or L series battery sleds on the back, 2 of them. Plus they have a TA4 input, so you can connect really big batteries and battery distribution systems. And in fact, on my sound card here with the 888, I have a big battery, basically a 1,000 watt-hour battery that sits at the bottom of the cart and can basically power my mixer and recorder plus all the wireless for a full production day, at least most of a production day, depending on how long the production day is. And that's another thing. I mean, production sound mixers are often working really, really long days. And so having something that's easy and quick and powerful to operate is important. Each of the inputs have configurable EQ, compression, analog limiter, and they all sound very good and they work really, really nicely. So I mean, it's just a pretty nice, something you don't see on the, again, most of the consumer and prosumer recorders. There is a bespoke control surface that gives you a much larger set of faders and buttons and knobs to control everything, as well as a very large screen. So just makes, again, operating from a sound cart quite a joy. And you can make the changes that you need to very, very quickly, which is important on a film set when time is money. And so there's less room for mistakes. And so having something that's really convenient and easy to get the settings and everything dialed in just right is really important for the production sound mixer. Just like the MixPre series, there are also plugins that are available. However, there are some higher-end plugins that are available. So in addition to Mix Assist, which we already talked about, which does auto mixing, there is also Dugan auto mixing, which is kind of an industry-leading algorithm for auto mixing. It's not available on any of the prosumer or consumer level recorders, and it just sounds really nice, very transparent, and does a great job of giving you a very clean mix. In addition to that, there is noise assist, just like on the MixPre, but there is also Cedar DNX, which again is another industry-leading real-time noise reduction algorithm that you can add as a plugin. And not only that, but you can add it up to 8 different channels or buses on the 8 series recorders, whereas on the MixPre series, for the noise assist, you can only apply it to a single channel. So, and that can be a mix, that's okay, but you can do it to 8 different instances on the 8 series. Lots of outputs, comms integrations, incredible build quality. This is like no compromise build quality. This thing, you could huck it off a building and it would probably be fine. And so all the kind of things that you would definitely expect on a pro level recorder. If you want to see the details, I do have reviews of both the Scorpio and the 833 down below. Now, SoundDevices is not the only game in town when it comes to providing recorders or mixers for production sound mixers. There are lots of others. The most common that you're going to see are the Aaton digital Cantar X3 and several of the different recorder mixers from Zaxcom, including the Nova, the Nomad, and the Deva. There's also another company called Sonosax that makes the SX R4 Plus. In the past, but we don't really see as many of these anymore. There's a company called Nagra that especially used to make the reel-to-reel analog tape recorders. They still make a digital recorder, but I don't see those quite as often. So hopefully that gives you a sense for all of the different recorders that are out there. Obviously, I haven't covered all of them. Those are just the ones that I've actually touched and used so that I could share my experience with you. I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave that down below. And if you've not already subscribed, make sure you do that. And we'll be sure to get you more great videos on how to improve your lighting and sound for video. Talk to you soon.